last night when I thought about the last Encorepreneur meeting we had. People, some of you may have been there. It was at the War Memorial, and we honored Nancy Robertson's mother, the code girl from World War II. And that was just 66 days ago. And to me, it seems like last year or longer than that. So I hope everyone is doing well in this time and is safe and sound and enjoying life as much as they can. I'm grateful we were able to get together so soon, and I'm thrilled we have such a good response. We sent out one email and about 270 people responded, and I see as of right now 180 of them have already signed on already. So it's great to see that. I think we could have had a lot more had we sent another email as we normally do. Thank you all for continuing on this new path with us, and I hope we can keep it interesting for you. So as we get started, I got a couple of announcements to make. One is the meeting is recorded so that we can make it available on the website soon. And now I know if you're having a really bad hair day, or if you spill your eggs on your pajama tops, don't leave. You can just use a little icon on your menu bar and turn off your video, and your name will remain on the screen so we'll know you're still here. So another thing that's important today is that you have two view options on your screen. The little icon at the top right says either gallery or speaker, and it'll flip you between having a picture of the speaker and having a picture of about 25 or 30 guests. And if you can choose whichever you like, but when the speaker starts, there'll be a PowerPoint presentation, and you'll see him see the PowerPoint on the screen. So you'll want to flip to the speaker view when that time comes. You're all muted for the rest of the meeting. We've tried before with larger meetings and people forget and the noise gets out, so we have had to mute it. But we do have chat. You can chat one-on-one with individuals, or you on the right-hand side of your screen. If you open that, click on the bottom, and it'll open on the right. And you can and as when we get to the speaker portion, you can also send questions in by just going to the bottom and typing, and it'll go to everyone. Okay, next, some recognition of the people that help us be where we are. First of all, the supporting Encorepreneurs. I'd like to give a shout out to all the supporting Encorepreneurs that have helped us so much over the last few years. With their financial help and the suggestions and the support. And normally I ask you to stand, but I don't think we need to do that today. So, but if you were in front of us, we'd be standing and we'd be clapping for you. I also like to thank Fahrenheit Advisors. There are at least 4 members of their team on board today: Jennifer Stern, Laura Bacon, Michael Moore, and Keith Middleton, the co-managing partners. And thank you very much for your support, Fahrenheit. And then another sponsor is Nancy Eberhardt, who's you'll see on your screen, and she's helping us out today. She's an author and the owner of Pathwise Partners, and she's been a great asset to the community during all this because she helps with change in corporations and organizations, and she's been very busy in the last 2 months with people, and I appreciate what she does for them and for us. Now, it's the first time I've seen Gary in a while, or haven't seen Gary in a while because he missed our last meeting, but I'd like to introduce Gary LeClaire for a few words.
Okay, Stan, just nod your head if I successfully unmuted. Perfect. Typically, we take a little poll at the beginning of these meetings asking how many of you would this be your first Encorepreneur meeting, or have you been to this location in the past? We're going to not do that today. The general notion of Encorepreneur is to help us get out of our comfort zone spiritually, physically, emotionally, something new in business. Today I'm going to talk about challenges, making them the best of them, and particularly how we think about time. You may recall the old movie Cheaper by the Dozen. And the dad in that movie was an efficiency expert. And one of the scenes in the movie was him timing himself buttoning his shirt from the top to the bottom, or the bottom from the top, trying to figure out which was the most efficient, which took the least amount of time. That's kind of stuck with me during this coronavirus challenge and trying to make the best of it. Clearly saving time by not having an hour's commute downtown to work, by ordering groceries online. And one of my favorites is that in the morning, thinking about cheaper by the dozen, I'm now in a habit of tucking my pants into my shirt. That takes a lot less time. You don't have to wear a belt. If you've been eating well at home and raiding the pantry, you don't even have to do the top button on your pants. You kind of leave that loose. And it does save a lot of time. So I've been using all this free time on trying to do things that are worthwhile. So I've organized the garage. I've organized the attic. I've organized that drawer in the kitchen that seems to collect everything. Old toothpicks, buttons, nail clippers, and all these things you don't know where to put. And I've come up with a lifetime supply by organizing and getting things in certain places. So I have enough pens for a lifetime, and just by getting them in the same places. Or I have enough matches forever. I found all my old ID cards stretching back to high school and college, and old passports and driver's licenses. Even found a bunch of 8mm tapes that, believe it or not, you can send in and somebody will turn those into something you could watch on modern devices. So it's that birthday party from 1970 something that would be fun to look at again. So it's been great to organize, but once you organize, what I found is that it leads to a second level of activity. So in organizing my matches, I found all these matches. This is hard to see, but this is a match from a wedding on June 26, 1976. Somehow I saved. And what I've been doing is working in reverse order, sending the matches to the couple and trying to track them down. And a couple cases I couldn't remember who they were, but we have all these matches and I've been sending them out. Or I found a bunch of old photos that I'm going to send out. Here's one of my sister getting, you can't see it probably, but this is her making a funny face getting dressed on her wedding day. I will send that. Or somehow I found old receipts. And this is the receipt for my college ring, which I haven't worn in 30 years. And so I put it together. Now, I don't know what good this will do. When my kids auction it off when I die, I guess it'll give them something to do. Maybe it'll make it worth something on Antique Roadshow. But in any event, using my time organizing, and anybody who wants to tour my garage, you're welcome to come over. It's just amazing how everything is organized. And so what do you do with all that free time? There's lots of things you can do once you've organized everything and you're very efficient. I want to mention two that will help support some of our local companies. One is you can order wine through Valley Road Vineyards. Stan Joins was one of our speakers a couple years ago in Charlottesville. They'll actually deliver wine to your doorstep in Richmond. Valley Road Vineyards, great wine. This is their Meritage, which rhymes with heritage. It's a Virginia blend. And finally, one more to talk about. A couple of local entrepreneurs, Vince Riggi and Brian Marks, have formed a Belle Isle Moonshine. Moonshine is the equivalent of vodka. Less calories than wine. Your kids love it. They also have canned cocktails. And thanks to the, we are getting some background noise. Thanks to some changes in the ABC laws, you can now order moonshine online. They'll deliver it to your home. If you want to drink vodka, this has less calories. If you want to impress your kids, you can give them canned cocktails, also from Belle Isle Moonshine. Most importantly, it would help some local entrepreneurs out by patronizing their business and supporting them during this time of challenge. So in any event, my thought for you is to make the best out of this coronavirus challenge. Find things that you can do to that ticked some boxes for you. Mine was organizing, and I've enjoyed it. And so I'll turn it back to Stan and Nancy to continue with the program.
Thank you, Gary. It's interesting about the distillers. We had a distiller speak, and one of their problems was that they couldn't deliver things. So things must have changed. I will contact them and find out. But I like your idea of these ideas of what to do, and we're going to send out some emails and some surveys and so forth in the future, and try to find some interesting things out. And your idea of what to do with your time is one of them. So. First, before I start to introduce our speaker, I'd like to remind you to use the chat function to ask questions while he's speaking. If you go to if you click on chat and go to the bottom right of your screen, you can ask a question. Nancy Everhart will be collecting those, and we'll share the ones that are asked the most with Dr. Gupton, who we're through. So on December 17th, thanks to an introduction by Brian Campbell from VCU, I had breakfast with today's speaker, Dr. Gupton. He's the head of the chemical engineering department at VCU, and he's founder of a group called Medicines for All, which is a public-private partnership. We talked about a lot of things that day, and you'll hear about a lot of them today, but and I asked him to speak while we were talking that morning sometime during 2020, but we didn't pick a date. 36 years later, when China locked down the Hunan province, and it's so that's so involved in the pharmaceutical industry, something that Dr. Gupton said came back to me really quickly. He told me during that December meeting that 80% of the supply of raw materials used in producing medicines for the U.S. come from China and India. And he added, if we lost those sources, we would be out of many drugs in this country in a matter of months. So I picked up the phone when I heard the news about China, called him and asked him how soon he could speak. And so fortunately, he's here today. Frank attended the University of Richmond on a basketball scholarship. He received a master's degree from Georgia Tech and got a doctorate in chemistry at VCU. He's 31-year career as a leader in the pharmaceutical industry, where he focused on efficient manufacturing of pharmaceuticals. He was a process guy. In 2007, he retired as the executive director of process development for Boehringer Ingelheim Pharmaceuticals, and he moved to Virginia Beach to enjoy a long retirement. But sitting on the beach, he did what many good Encorepreneurs do, and he started thinking about what's next. The answer was he thought of a way to produce life-saving drugs more efficiently. And so 8 years later, instead of enjoying his retirement, he's running, 13 years later, excuse me, or 11 years later, he's running Medicines for All. The last few years, they've received $40 million in funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, DARPA, and more from DARPA and other organizations. They have 50 staff and students that make up Medicines for All, are focused on improving access to life-saving drugs for patients around the world with diseases like malaria and tuberculosis and HIV. And he'll tell us about all of that this morning. Dr. Frank Gupton.
Stan, thank you very much for the introduction. Just as a prelude, when Stan invited me to breakfast, he said, why don't we meet at Pearlie's? And I'd been there a few times, but I didn't realize how frequently Stan had been there, because when I got there, we sat down and the waiter came up and he said, would you like the usual? And I knew that this was Stan's turf, so I knew that I should behave myself. So Stan, I'm going to try and put the slides, my slideshow up here, and bear with me for a second. First, I have to find my cursor. Okay, I'm assuming everybody can see that now. Stan, can you see that?
It looks good.
Okay, so this first slide is kind of my go-to slide. But before I did that, I wanted to say that I saw a lot of old familiar faces from my past. My roommate from college, Tom Shockley, and one of my old colleagues, Bob Beckler, I saw in the as attending. So shout out to those guys. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing with Medicines for All and where we're headed with this. But I think Stan did me a real service in this title, because I had something that was a lot less current than what he came up with. So Stan, thanks very much for the editing of the title of my talk. As Stan mentioned earlier, I had a very enjoyable career in both the chemical and the pharmaceutical industry. And from 1993 to 2007, I was head of North American process development for a German pharmaceutical company, Boehringer Ingelheim. And for those of you who don't know Boehringer, there's probably a reason for that, because it's a pretty well kept secret. It's the largest privately held pharmaceutical company in the world. It's owned by a family, and it's about $18 billion in annual sales, and it's in the top 10 of all pharmaceutical companies in the world. And I was very fortunate to spend my time there at Boehringer. And then in 2006, I started thinking about retirement, and I'm from Virginia Beach. And so my wife and I started construction of a house down at Sandbridge. And so we built that house, started in 2006, finished in 2007, and I retired. And then I was actually happily retired and was playing a lot of golf, and my golf game had improved quite a bit. And I got a call from VCU. I'd been on the advisory board for the engineering school ever since it started. And the dean of the humanities and sciences was a chemist and an old friend of mine. And the two of them got together and asked me if I'd be willing to take a joint appointment between chemistry and chemical engineering. My background is in organic chemistry, but my research groups were typically a 50-50 mix of chemists and chemical engineers. So in 2008, I joined the faculty at VCU, and I'd been there about 6 months. And the dean of the engineering school came to me and he said, you've managed a large research group before. He said, would you be willing to be our interim department chair? And so I acquiesced and did that. So for five years, I was the interim department chair, and we got a new dean, Barbara Boyan, who's really terrific. I really enjoyed having Barbara here at VCU, and she approached me with the idea of becoming the permanent department chair. And she said, I'd really like to drop the interim title. And I told her I'd much rather drop the chair title, but she talked me into it. And so for the last 6 years, I've been the department chair for chemical engineering. Now, I was at a party at Christmas time, and I heard my wife talking to a friend of hers, and she was asking me about my second career at VCU, and her comment was this: Frank was a complete failure when it came to retirement. And I think that's probably one of the truest statements my wife has ever said. This is not what I expected to be doing at this stage of my life, but I can't imagine doing anything differently. So I'll take a quick second and talk a little bit about my research group. Stan touched on it a little. But on the left-hand side is I basically got 3 buckets of funds for our research group. One is the Medicines for All Institute, which is funded primarily by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And they basically invested approximately $40 million in this endeavor. And it's an effort to try and increase access to HIV drugs globally, particularly in Africa. Then in the middle, we were able to secure a National Science Foundation Center grant to develop new catalysts that can be used to improve the efficiency of pharmaceutical processes. And then in the third bucket, on the far right-hand side, is our Pharmacy on Demand project, and it's funded by DARPA, DARPA is kind of the research arm of the Department of Defense. And they brought you everything from GPS to actually they invented the internet. And this unit you see here depicted on the right is our Pharmacy on Demand module, and it's currently being used to make ciprofloxacin. And the unit's about the size of a refrigerator. You put the chemicals in the front end, it synthesizes the active ingredient, formulates it, and pills come out the back. And you can produce about 1,000 pills a day with this thing. So all of these activities are interrelated. And they have a common theme of a thing called process intensification, and also using continuous processing to improve the efficiency of these methods. So process intensification is a term that a lot of people don't understand or are familiar with. And so I thought I'd just take a quick second and explain it. And it's any process change that leads to substantially smaller, cleaner, safer, or more energy efficient technology. And so what we focus on, and a lot of the things that drive that are energy usage, safety, productivity and capacity, flexibility, and particularly waste and cost and complexity of the processes. So ideally what you end up with is a much smaller footprint for the facility that you're operating with. And so the issues that we have here that we look at are the chemistry, the equipment that we're using, the raw materials that we're sourcing. We'll also focus on waste minimization and the use of the new catalysts that we've developed. But what's really interesting is that the area that we're working in is at the interface of chemistry and chemical engineering. And when you think about what a lot of academia is about, it's basically siloed systems where you're looking at a specific discipline. And this is a very unique platform that we have here at VCU, in that chemists and chemical engineers cohabitate in my lab, since I have joint appointments, and I have PhD students in both areas. And the benefit is that now the students are actually understanding what they're going to be experiencing when they get into industry, because they're going to cohabitate in that same way. And they've really benefited from that and cross-trained each other. Excuse me. So I wanted to take a second to kind of give you an idea about what the current pharmaceutical industry is like versus normal manufacturing. So when I think of manufacturing, I typically think of Henry Ford and the assembly line that he developed at the turn of the century. And in contrast to that, this is what a pharmaceutical operation looks like in China. It's a bunch of events that are occurring in parallel in a bunch of different reactors. What we are envisioning for the future is something entirely different. And that's this unit on the right. This is a unit that was built by GlaxoSmithKline to make a drug called fluticasone, which is used in Advair. And that's a very big drug, and the world supply of Advair is made in these small units. And it's done continuously versus batch. So the point being is that the chemistry that we develop drives the complexity of the processes, from everything from the unit operations to the return on investment for these drugs. So to understand the difference between batch versus continuous processes, the analogy I like to use is making spaghetti. So making spaghetti sauce is a batch process. Typically small volumes, higher operating costs, greater flexibility, it's multi-purpose equipment, your pot, and higher capital cost per kilogram of output. But you also have much greater variability in the product quality. And in contrast, a continuous process is how you make pasta, where it's typically run with commodity chemicals and high volume, a lower operating cost per kilogram of output, limited flexibility, it's usually dedicated equipment, and a lower capital cost per kilogram of output, and very importantly, more consistent product quality. And when you think about it, each batch of spaghetti sauce tastes a little bit different, but all the pasta tastes the same. And that's okay when you're making spaghetti, but when you're making drugs, it's not a good thing. So one of the things the FDA has been pushing is getting the pharmaceutical companies to move more towards continuous manufacturing in order to be able to get more reproducibility in their methods, in their processes. So I thought I'd start off with just a little bit of a quiz about about what's going on in U.S. access to pharmaceuticals. I think Stan touched on this a little bit, but there are more than 100 drugs in short supply in the U.S. today. And actually, I think the number is more about 400 drugs. And it's everything from oncology drugs to cardiology drugs. And there's even been a saline shortage. And, you know, when you start thinking about it, if we can't make saline here in the United States, we've got real problems. We shouldn't even be talking about drugs. But as Stan mentioned earlier, approximately 80% of all medicines consumed in the U.S. are produced in India and China. And what's also very interesting is that commercial, when I say APIs, I'm referring to the active pharmaceutical ingredients. Those processes produce between 50 and 200 kilograms of waste per kilogram of product. Those are very conservative numbers. I've seen processes that are that generate several hundred kilograms of waste per kilogram of product of the active ingredient. And so these all are related to supply chain vulnerability that we're currently seeing in the marketplace. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So about a year ago, I had several encounters with different people. I'm going to talk about them today, but one of the first and most important was a lady named Rosemary Gibson. And Rosemary came to see me about in December of 2018. And Rosemary had written a book called China RX, and I would encourage those of you who are interested in this to read it. It's absolutely fascinating. And it talks about the vulnerability of the U.S. supply chain of healthcare. But the problem that we have right now is that with the high volume of drugs and starting materials that are used to make the drugs being produced in China, the Chinese government has recognized the pollution issues that they've got over there. And with all the waste generated from these pharma companies, they've been major targets by the Chinese government for shutdown. And Beijing shut down 1,000, is planning to shut down 1,000 pharmaceutical manufacturing operations in 2020. And what this has done is it's created these shortages as well as a rapid increase in the cost of these drugs over here in the United States. So this is an issue with regards to the fragility of the pharmaceutical marketplace and maybe some of the unintended consequences of trying to control the cost of healthcare. So in 2006, the federal government established price controls for these drugs. And what ended up happening is that several of the drugs that had very small margins, it forced those companies to discontinue those drugs in favor of more profitable drugs. So from 2006 to 2011, the marketplace went from 70 drugs in short supply to 267 in short supply. It's come down a bit, but the numbers are still much too high. The other thing that's kind of concerning with regards to Chinese manufacturing, this is a graph of penicillin prices. And if you look at the red bar, that's the total global consumption of penicillin. And the blue bar is the amount of production of penicillin in China. And you can see from 1986 to 2007, they've actually captured about 80% of that market. And during that period, they were basically buying into the market. And in 2004, they reached a low point for the cost of penicillin. And ever since then, the price has been going up. And now that they're basically controlling the market. So the other problem that we've had is the quality of the products coming out of China. So we've had, I don't know if y'all recall this, but in 2018, there was a major recall of the major antihypertensive drug, valsartan. And the problem was that the Chinese manufacturer changed the solvent in the process. They changed it to solvent called dimethylformamide. And when they heated it up, it generated a carcinogen that contaminated the product. And there was a major recall of valsartan. And I think they're still having problems with that. And then in addition, there was this issue with heparin several years ago with heparin contamination that caused several deaths in the United States. But quality issues still persist in China, and particularly overseas in places like Africa that are buying HIV drugs from China. So the folks at DARPA gave me this chart. This is our current U.S. supply chain, and what you should be able to take away from this is it's much too complex. From the time a drug leaves the pharmaceutical company until when it touches the consumer, until it gets in their hands, the drug is touched several times. Each organization takes a profit. So this is where there's an opportunity, I believe, to be able to simplify our supply chain and increase access to these drugs. So part of what we're doing with the Gates Foundation is trying to do just that, is to drive down the cost, which would ultimately increase access to these drugs. We don't see HIV, it's not nearly as prevalent in the United States or visible in the United States as it is in places like Africa. There's about 35 million infected patients globally, and of those, about 25 million of them are located on the African continent. And we have 2.1 new infections annually, and about 1.5 million deaths from HIV across the globe. Interestingly enough, though, there were approximately 216 million malaria cases in 2016. That was the latest data that I had. And approximately 80% of those were in Africa. Likewise, this is something that I didn't know that the Gates Foundation informed me on, is that there's a new strand of tuberculosis out there that's resistant to current treatments. And there are about 10 million tuberculosis cases reported in 2016, and most of those, over 70%, were in Africa. So, and the tuberculosis deaths are linked to HIV for compromised patients. But the interesting thing is that the Gates Foundation informed me of that I wasn't aware of, but there is a particular concern, is that the population of the African continent is projected to double over the next 10 years. And it's the only place in the globe that's really expected to see any significant population growth. So this, in the same space where you're seeing this expansion of personnel, is a hotbed of infection. And, you know, we see this as an unmet need that needs to be addressed over our time. So if you look at the grand challenges in global healthcare, obviously access is an issue, but also environmental sustainability becomes an important component to that, because we want to ensure strength of the supply chain, and that these and preclude a lot of these pharmaceutical manufacturing operations shutting down. So this is kind of the focus of the Medicines for All Institute. So the vision of the Institute is to be a global change agent for pharmaceutical process development, to be able to drive down the cost and increase the quality of the drugs coming out of our processes. And the idea would be our approach is to use an end-to-end philosophy, looking at everything from starting materials all the way to the finished goods as a way of being able to ensure access to these drugs. And in doing that, we would obviously reduce treatment costs. But I think the other thing that's really important, and not something that we can't forget, is that VCU is an academic institution. And so one of the things that we're going to be doing is to affect change. We want to be able to train the next generation of scientists that are uniquely equipped to be able to address these issues. And, you know, most of what we're doing, I have this quote here up top, which is kind of the theme of our organization. And that is, discovery is seeing what everybody else has seen and thinking what nobody else has thought. These are old drugs that have been around for a long time, and we're just figuring out how to make them much more efficient than they've been made in the past. So if you start looking at why are there such opportunities to be able to drive costs down, this is something that the Gates Foundation, it was an epiphany for them, and in our discussions as we were moving the Institute forward, we came to a realization that there are different fundamental drivers for patented drugs versus generic drugs. And so if you look at the pie chart on the left side, that blue part of the pie chart represents the active ingredient cost, which is somewhere between 5 and 10%. Usually it's around 5%. And on the other side, the generic drugs are the active ingredient cost represents about 50 to 70% of the drug. And so what you're paying for in that red space for the patented drug is all the R&D costs that go along with making that drug. Right now, the cost to bring one drug to the marketplace is about $2 billion. And the payback period, the window that pharmaceutical companies are looking at is about 8 years. And this is a really important element because getting this product out in the marketplace as quickly as possible is the main driver for this, for these drugs. And so there's, from the time a molecule becomes a drug candidate until when they start clinical trials is only about 18 months. And so there's a limited window for optimizing the process for these drugs to make the active ingredients. And the time to market is the key driver. And so the interesting component to this is that once they start clinical trials, they don't want to change the process, so they lock it down. And sometimes you'll end up with a suboptimal process that gets implemented in the marketplace. And then when the drug goes generic, the active ingredient costs, you've actually removed all the R&D costs, so the active ingredient costs become a major cost driver. And you're using a suboptimal process that was developed sometimes 20 years earlier. Here's a timeline to kind of give you a perspective on that. From the 18-month period from when a drug candidate becomes a drug that can be moved forward into clinical trials. And then the patent life is about 20 years. And so when the drug goes to generic status and they go to for FDA approval for that, the FDA requirement is to establish equivalency. And that's not better, that's not worse, that's exactly the same. So there's not a big incentive, or it's basically disincentivizes these generic manufacturers to make major changes in the process in order to receive their FDA approval to make the product. So our objective of our work is to expand global access to life-saving medications by finding new ways to make them more efficiently. We do that with new synthetic methods, novel manufacturing platforms, reducing the environmental impact, and developing commercial implementation networks to be able to introduce these. And then in doing so, understanding the life cycle of management issues associated with these drugs. So these are the boundary conditions for working in my lab with my students. And it starts with generating very efficient processes for individual reactions to make the drug. Typically, to make an active ingredient, it requires 3 to 5 chemical steps, discrete chemical steps, to be able to convert the starting materials to products. So each one of those reactions, we require them to be very high yielding reactions, typically 90% yields or better. So then we start looking at comparable reaction conditions so that we can actually look at these things more holistically and use common reagents and solvents. And then and then go back in the process to very simple building blocks that are very inexpensive. And then lastly, once we've done all of that, we take those processes and figure out how we can consolidate them and into a minimal number of unit operations to improve the efficiency of the processes. Now, when I start looking at these from a hierarchy perspective, high yielding reactions is probably the most important thing that we can come up with. And these limiting unit operations are basically outcome opportunities as a result of doing all these other things correctly. Now, I constantly preach to the students that most of this stuff is common sense and we should be doing this anyway. And one of my students told me one day, he said, common sense is not a gift, it's a punishment, because you have to deal with everyone that doesn't have it. He's now at Pfizer leading a big research group, so he's going to do well, and I think he understands that some of the challenges that he's faced with in trying to change the pharmaceutical industry and the way we operate in the future. So why do we generate so much waste in these processes? So this is a typical scheme of how one individual step is carried out in a pharmaceutical operations to convert a starting material or an intermediate into the active ingredient or a downstream intermediate. So on the fourth floor of the building is the reactor where all the chemistry takes place. And then once they've made the product, they crystallize it, they transfer it to the third floor and crystallize the product. And then once the product is crystallized, then they'll separate the solid product with a centrifuge and then dry it on the first floor. Now, typically anywhere between 50 to 75%, actually it's more like 75 to 90% of the mass that goes into that reactor is solvent. And the problem is that the solvents and byproducts come out in the centrifuge and in the dryer, and this represents a major source of waste that's being generated in these processes. So this is, for a 5-step process, this is one step in a 5-step process, so that about somewhere between 3 to 4 times as much of the starting material is generated as waste. And so this is, creates a real issue with regards to waste management, and that's if you got a very high yielding reaction. So the question is, why do we isolate these intermediates? And the reason we isolate them is to try and purge the impurities from the product. And so if you have high yielding reactions, there may not be a need to do these individual separations, which would allow you to be able to avoid generating all this waste. So our end-to-end approach is to develop novel chemistry that's very efficient, and then transfer it to the manufacturers in a second step, and then they implement the processes. And what's interesting is the Gates Foundation has been, I should have known this when I started the project, that Bill Gates is a smart guy, but he actually tracks all of these improvements to see what his return on investment was. And typically what we've been getting is somewhere around for each drug, we've been paid about $5 million to develop a new process, which takes about 18 months. And the payback period on that investment is usually less than a year. So the Gates Foundation gave us 2 drugs to work on in this phase 1 proof of concept. And we were very successful at it. So they came back to me and they said, we'd really like for you to be able to work on multiple drugs in parallel. And I said, well, I can't do that. There's just one of me. And they said, well, what if we gave you enough money to establish an institute at VCU to be able to bring in people like yourself to be able to accelerate and expand the capacity of this operation? So I said, well, I need a long enough runway to be able to recruit these people. So they gave me a 5-year grant and $25 million for this phase 2 scale up. And so at the end of that scale up period, they don't want to be our grantor. They want to be a customer. So the goal is at the end of that 5-year period for us to be self-sustainable and to be able to do between 3 and 4 drugs every year. It was a lofty challenge, but they've been extremely great partners in this effort, and we've been very fortunate and successful in doing that. So when you start looking at the cost structure, the Gates Foundation and VCU have contributed not equally, but substantially. The Gates VCU will put up about $13.2 million on the project, and the Gates Foundation will have put somewhere close to $40 million on the project. So this is probably one of the few chemistry slides I've put up. This is strictly to give you an idea of the level of complexity of the projects that we're working on. And these are all the drugs that we've developed over the last processes that we've developed over the last 5 years. And if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see hydroxychloroquine. And that's gotten a lot of press over the last few months. And it was something that we did as a project with DARPA to develop a continuous process for it. And my computer kind of blew up a few weeks ago when I was getting all of these emails from Italy asking if they could use our process. But about half of these drugs are HIV drugs, and those are the ones that we've primarily focused on with the Gates Foundation. So I'll give you an example. Nevirapine is I think it was the second HIV drug approved in the marketplace. And it was a Boehringer Ingelheim product. And it's probably the reason why the Gates Foundation contacted me. While I was at BI, I developed a process to make this compound. And one of the really big advantages of it is it's great. It's a great drug for perinatal applications for treating expectant mothers, and you give it to the expectant mother right before she goes into labor, and then you give it to the infant after it's born, and the infant won't have HIV. And this is really important because what the Gates Foundation has told me is that approximately 30% of the women of childbearing age in Africa have HIV. So this is something that really does help curb the HIV infection with the newborns. So this was the original process when I was at BI that we transferred in and launched in our site in Petersburg, Virginia. And then we came up with a second generation process that looks like this. And this is a batch process, and each one of those round spheres is a reactor. So you can see how the level of complexity of each one of those processes. So we developed a second generation process that we felt like was pretty good. And then the Gates Foundation came to me and said, well, could we do better? And I really thought we had a pretty good process, but we were able to come up with something that was dramatically better. And that's what the new process looks like right now. And it's actually being practiced in China. If you start looking at the metrics, we were able to increase the overall yield of the process from about 55% to 94%. We also reduced the number of process steps and unit operations to about a third of what it currently is being run at. But what was really dramatic was the waste generation. The process actually wasn't that bad on a relative basis. We were generating about 65 to 70 kilos of waste per kilogram of product. And we were able to cut that to 4 with the new chemistry that we developed. And it basically showed what could be done by reinventing these processes and making them more efficient. And the Gates Foundation tracked it, and we were able to reduce the cost by about 20%. And one of the things we did do, though, was we shared the savings with the manufacturer. And then what that did was it helped to strengthen the supply chain of the drug and ensure that the manufacturers would stay in the market. So on the left-hand side of the 3 HIV regimens that are currently being practiced globally, and they're a combination of different HIV drugs, and we've developed new processes for each one of them, of those components. And when you start looking at the benefit for the savings that we've had from these drugs, you're looking at an annual savings of approximately $85 to $90 million for these 3 regimens on an annualized basis. So I'll take a quick second and talk a little bit about our Pharmacy on Demand project. As I mentioned earlier, it's about the size of a refrigerator. You put in the chemicals, it's an automated system. It converts the active ingredients to the formulated product, and you can produce about 1,000 pills of Cipro a day with this thing. I'm going to digress a little bit and talk a little bit more about the supply chain, because this is really kind of the heart of the title of my talk. This is Marshall Summer. Marshall is a friend of mine. He's head of the Rare Disease Division at Children's National Hospital. Marshall and his wife Karen came to see me. Both of them are pediatricians, and Karen works for Senator Grassley's office in helping to shape our national healthcare program. The two of them brought to my attention this issue about the fact that all newborns now in the United States are tested for genetic deficiencies. And the problem is that the volumes are so low, there's very simple drugs to treat them, but they're just not available. The pharmaceutical companies can't afford to make them. So if you can imagine a pediatrician coming to the parents of a newborn saying, your child has a genetic deficiency, there's a drug to treat it, we can't get the drug, and your child's going to die. And this happens every day in the United States, and it happens too frequently every day in the United States. So Marshall was proposing to us that we maybe could have the opportunity to set up a repository for these drugs where we could actually produce them here and then ship them off to the active ingredients off to the children's hospitals and have them formulate them remotely. So that's one of the things that we're actually working on right now. The second person that came to see me, and this is, Rosemary Gibson, Marshall, and this gentleman, Martin Van Triest, came to see me within a period of about a week's time in December of 2018. Martin, I've known for some time. He was part of the leadership at Amgen, but he came to see me because he's now CEO of this company called Civica RX. And I know this sounds like a misnomer or a non sequitur, but it's a not-for-profit generic pharmaceutical company. And what it is it's a consortium of all the major hospitals in the United States. I think it's like 1,500 major hospitals. And this is kind of an old slide, but Marshall, I think, is up to about $300 million raised. And the problem they have is that all these hospitals are limiting in their operating room capacity because they can't get the drugs they need to perform the procedures. So Mayo Clinic, Kaiser Permanente, Intermountain Healthcare, all these major Catholic hospitals in the United States, HCA are all members of this. And so Martin has been stood up this pharmaceutical organization to be able to supply drugs specifically to the hospital systems. So when you start looking at the overall from a healthcare perspective, you know, we've got these drug shortages, we've got issues with drug contamination, we've got problems with orphan drugs for genetic deficiencies and pollution that are really straining our national healthcare supply chain. Unfortunately, what's going on is that folks like Civica and looking at decentralized manufacturing of drugs and trying to increase global access to these drugs by making these processes more energy efficient is kind of the good news that's taking place here, right here in Richmond. This is my research group, and it's a lot larger than a lot of research groups, and I've been very fortunate to be able to get the kind of funding that we received. But the last thing I'm going to leave you with is this issue about I refer to myself as a habitual collaborator because I tend to pull in people to help me solve problems. And one of the things I've found is that over the years is that the really important things to understand are that you should know what you know and know what you don't know, and seek help from those who know what you don't know. Look for a win-win in all cases, because that will help sustain that collaboration. And then share the recognition. And lastly, probably most importantly, is that money helps. It's a great lubricant for collaborations. And with that, I'd like to comment that this whole idea about elegance and simplicity is kind of the underpinning themes of all the work that we're doing. And Stan, thanks again for the opportunity to talk to your group.
Stan, we can't hear you.
Nancy, I'm going to turn things over to Nancy Eberhardt now to ask questions.
Thanks so much, Dr. Gupton. We had many questions. I'm going to try to hit on the ones that got some extra charge on them. Hampton Carver wanted to know, considering the problems the U.S. faces with availability of medicines, even the PPE, is offshoring the reason? And if you believe that's the case, do you see a path to meeting America's needs for a more diversified onshore marketplace for solving this?
Boy, that was something that I am very well aligned with. Nancy, what I would like to say is I can't really talk about it, but there are things happening today and hopefully in the near future that not only will address this issue about bringing manufacturing onshore, but also bringing it to Virginia. So I can't really talk too much about it, but stay tuned. This could be a very big event for the greater Richmond area. The point that I think about is that the reason why continuous manufacturing, I think, is so appealing is the reason why people went to China is because these batch processes are very labor intensive, and the cost of goods is reflected by that. So most of these continuous processes are relatively automated. And so you create a more level playing field with regards to being able to produce these materials over here in the United States versus anywhere else in the world. So if you think about innovation and automation and things that we're good at, we should be able to do this.
Terrific, thank you. Robert wanted to know, with all the focus on the COVID response, is there any risk in your mind to losing focus and resources on the world's still most deadly infectious diseases such as TB, malaria, et cetera?
I think there's a little bit, the thing I think about a little bit differently, Nancy, is I think what's happened in the United States is we're very isolated. We have very, on a relative basis, we've had a fairly robust healthcare program, and most of us have had access to the drugs that we needed, unlike a lot of places around the world. I think that what the COVID-19 has done, if there's any good that's come out of it, it's really shined a light on this problem. And so from my perspective, the real challenge that we have is to make sure that we're vigilant in addressing the problem. Once the COVID-19 problem is addressed, we don't walk away from this issue about our supply chain vulnerability for healthcare.
Thank you. John would like to know how you think AI will impact the cost and speed of R&D for new drugs.
I think it's going to help. I didn't talk about this much, but if you looked at the slides that I was doing with the folks at DARPA, there was a pharmacy on demand project, and there was also a project called Make It, and it was a follow-up funding opportunity that we had. And so I was working with the chair of the chemistry department at MIT and the chair of the chemical engineering department at MIT, and what we're doing is using machine learning to be able to optimize processes and going back into the literature and identifying as many ways possible as to make the molecule through machine learning, and then an AI, and then use those methods to be able to evaluate which is actually the most cost-effective way of producing the molecule. And one of the things I will tell you is that scientists, whether they choose to admit it or not, are personally biased. And so we tend to migrate towards the things that we've had success with and migrate away from the things that we didn't have success with. So in doing that, we often eliminate through our personal biases, new chemistries that we could use to be able to produce these materials. So to me, I think that AI has a place. I don't think it's the be all end all yet, but it's certainly going to help us to be able to not only accelerate the way we identify new biologically active materials, but also how to produce them more efficiently.
Thank you. Jean wanted to know what kind of regs are there in place for India and China. She believes we get a lot of contaminated foods products from China, pet products. So what about the drugs we're currently receiving?
I think this is probably kind of the ugly secret about producing in the U.S. I know when I was in industry, when we would have these biannual inspections from the FDA, they took 2 weeks minimum. If they didn't find anything, it took about 2 weeks. An inspection in India or China are usually less than a day. So, and they have a tough time getting inspectors to go over there to do the inspections in the first place. But now they can't even go over there and inspect them. So we've got a real issue moving forward with how we're going to be able to assure product quality in these drugs coming out of China and India. I think the other thing that's been very interesting, Nancy, is I've gotten a lot of calls over the last few weeks from major manufacturers in India who have said they want to work with us because now they're getting their starting materials from China, and they realize that they can't make their vulnerability with regards to their supply chain, and they want to be able to make their own starting materials and use some of the practices that we're using right now to be able to make them more efficient.
Oh, great. And I will wrap up. You know, a lot of the questions came in because they want you to opine a little bit on the COVID virus.
Yeah.
Do you have any realistic hope? This is from Marguerite. Regarding resources and intelligence at our disposal that a vaccine for COVID-19 will occur sooner than 12 to 15 months?
I'm a little bit more pragmatic than that, Nancy. Here's the thing I think about is you start thinking about vaccines. There was the past few viral epidemics that we've had or pandemics that we've had. They still don't have vaccines for those viruses. And if you look at HIV as a classic case, they were never able to get a vaccine for that. I think that the real opportunity is more in developing antiviral drugs to treat these things. There are two drugs out there. Some of you all have heard of this drug called remdesivir, and that I'm working with the Gates Foundation right now to try and figure out how to make that probably more efficiently. It's a very difficult molecule to make, and we're working with them on that process. There's another drug by a small company out of Florida. It's a good friend of mine who I worked with for years, and they developed an antiviral drug that seems to have a lot of promise too. I think that probably that's a more realistic solution to the problem than the vaccines. Now, you know, I'm not really sure how hydroxychloroquine works, but everybody, I actually had my physical yesterday, and my doctor was telling me, he said that he's been, I probably shouldn't say this in public, but he's been giving hydroxychloroquine to his patients who are starting to develop symptoms. And he said it's remarkable from that perspective. It works very well. His concern was for patients that are, you know, in the latter stages of the virus that are getting ready to go on ventilators. It doesn't seem to have much of an effect on them. One of the things I did learn from him was he said that that the virus attacks the hemoglobin in the system, and it basically acts like carbon monoxide poisoning, which I was really surprised. I didn't realize that was the mode of action it was working on. But if I were a betting man, I had to put my money on it, I'd put it on an antiviral drug as opposed to a vaccine.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Gupton. There are many more questions, and we could talk to you all day, but I imagine people from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the U.S. government might want to bump us off. So I'm going to turn it back over to Stan. Thank you so much.
Hey, Nancy and Stan, before you go, you know, I was really, first of all, I want to thank you all for tuning in on this. One of the things I just wanted to do, you know, the old term, there is no free lunch. This is probably too well. I don't think many of you probably knew any of this was going on in Richmond, and this was kind of the epicenter for all this activity. So we've got 200 people here. Use this opportunity to try and advance the cause here and have a real appreciation for the investments that have been made at VCU to try and advance this technology.
Thank you, Dr. Gupton. I think that's a great way to sum up. I've read, in preparing for this, I've read the websites and things about what you're doing, and it's very impressive. I encourage people to do that. So.
Well, it's not what I expected to be doing at this stage of my life, Stan, but I'd still get down to the beach house periodically.
I don't think anybody's doing what they expected to do in their stage of the life right now. I want to thank you again. I understand your favorite book is Who's Your Caddy? Oh, by the way, one thing I forgot to mention, Dr. Gupton and I have two things in common. One is we both got D's in chemistry in high school. And
absolutely true, Stan.
And two, our favorite show is Big Bang Theory. So, but I also know that your your favorite book is Who's Your Caddy, a book about golf. And so we have a book that we're going to give you, written by an author of William and Mary professor about a Virginia Beach golfer who did some amazing things in the 40s. And so we'll be getting that to you as soon as we can.
Thank you,
Very
sir.
much. And just to wrap up, now that we've been to your homes, we plan to be back. We don't know who and when yet at this point. We have a few things scheduled, but not in the next month. So we will be getting back to you, and we'll be using this. Hopefully, getting in touch with you with some questions and ideas about how we might use technology to continue to work for Encorepreneur. So thank you very much. By the way, we had a 200 and about almost 220 people here today, and I thank you all for coming, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks, Tim.
Good night.
Night.
Goodbye. I mean morning.